author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Hello and welcome to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio American Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's show, we are asking whether Trump is ready to rumble in Washington, D.C., what the Democrats plan to do about it, and what's happened to those pesky never-Trumpers. It's going to be quite the show. Please remember, Liberty Nation Radio is sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. And you're on Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio American Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides, and we're joined, very fortunately, by a long-time host of this here radio show and Liberty Nation senior political analyst, Mr. Tim Donner. Thanks for being here, Tim. Happy New Year to you.
Happy New Year to you. Always a pleasure, Mark.
So we're fast approaching Donald Trump's second inauguration, which should be quite the spectacle in Washington, D.C. But the question I'm really curious about is, do you think he's ready for the big show? What I mean is he more ready now than he was when he became president back in 2017?
Well, it's not even close. In 2017, he came into Washington with virtually no allies. He was a stranger in a strange land. He was someone who had all of about one senator who outwardly supported him. It was Jeff Sessions, who then he appointed as Attorney General, and it didn't work out at all. But he was like an alien creature to the Washington swamp. And with no allies, he was forced to really rely on the advice and counsel of people he didn't even know, who were recommended to him, one or two steps removed. And so he really was in a position where he had to select people for his cabinet and heads of agencies that he did not know personally. And he had no idea that the swamp was ready to take him down from the first minute. On that day in 2017, the day that Donald Trump was inaugurated, the Washington Post ran a story saying the impeachment effort against Donald Trump has already begun. And this was literally minutes after he was inaugurated. He had no idea what he was in for because he didn't know his way around Washington, and they had it in for him. And of course, they stalled his presidency with fake investigations, with the Steele dossier, with James Comey's FBI investigation, into Russia collusion, which went nowhere. But it took 2 years for everybody to know that it was all a big fake. This time, he knows exactly where, so to speak, the bodies are buried. He knows that they're out to one. He's got allies galore. He has been elected by a very decisive margin in both the Electoral College and the popular vote. And he started really the day after he had won with cabinet appointments and appointments to as heads of agencies. And he's off to a running start like I've never seen for a president-elect, because he knows he's only got 4 years. The first time, in 2017, he figured he might have 8 years to figure out the landscape and get things done. But of course, he didn't. They took him down in 2020. And now he knows he's got 4 years. He's got an incredibly ambitious agenda, but he's got people surrounding him who are true believers this time. So there's really not even a comparison to this second term in comparing it to his first term that started 8 years ago.
So I love the analogy you used there, the stranger in a strange land. And then you went and say that he was an alien in Washington, D.C. And I think, yes, he's failing to grok. He was failing to grok what the swamp was, to continue that analogy. But you mentioned the nominees that he essentially must have had in place even before the election. I think outreach began well before that. Now, we saw that Matt Gaetz, former Florida congressman and former prospective for the attorney general position, the media did a full court press against him, and he ended up withdrawing from the nomination. But since then, everything's been all silent on the Western swamp front, as it were. And we're not hearing these negative stories about Pam Bondi, very few about RFK Jr. Kash Patel, that was a storm in a teacup for a few days, and now nobody's talking about it. Is this because, and I think I've probably got this right, is that any ammunition that the left-leaning media and Democrats could have used against these potential nominees has already been spent. And so they would just be, as it were, flogging a dead horse between now and when the actual confirmation process comes around. And it would kind of seem like sour grapes more than they're just exposing the reality of what things are.
Well, they're going to have to pick their spots, the Democrats, in terms of who they're going to try and trash among Trump's appointments that are subject to Senate confirmation. Because they can't trash all of them, because then they'll lose all credibility and it'll really hurt their political future for 2026 and 28. So they're going to have to pick their spots carefully. The problem for the left is that there's so many appointees by Trump that are so controversial for Democrats, such as Pete Hegseth at Defense. You mentioned Kash Patel as head of the FBI, and a host of others that, Pam Bondi's relatively uncontroversial because she's very qualified to become Attorney General. But they're going to have to pick their spots. And I think if they felt that if they were complaining all along from the day that Trump was elected, that people would be tired of their criticism by now. So I think what they're doing is they're garnering their forces, deciding who it is they're going to put whatever political capital they have behind trying to oppose and go after them. And I think it may be Pete Hegseth at Defense. It could be Kash Patel. They can't oppose all of them because they have no credibility and they don't have the vote.
Some would argue that ship has already sailed.
Well, they've only got 47 votes in the Senate, right? And the Republicans have 53. So it's really a matter of which nominees they might be able to convince some Republicans to join them in opposition. But I think we'll start hearing that very soon. And the Democrats will be throwing a lot of stink bombs, excuse me, at a lot of these nominees, but probably to very little effect.
Yeah, I think with the Senate makeup at the moment and with it does seem that Donald Trump is wielding power absolute even before he is inaugurated. And it does seem
he's acting as if he's the president, but more importantly, he's being treated as if he's the president by foreign leaders. And we see these tech moguls bending the knee, kissing the ring. I mean, it was a huge story that came out this week that Meta, Facebook, Instagram, Mark Zuckerberg says he's going to quit censoring users of his platforms, just like Elon Musk did on X. And there's only one reason for that, because they know the Biden era has crashed and burned, and it's a second Trump era, and everybody wants to get on his good side, which is quite a contrast to 2017, where the likes of Zuckerberg were, plotting to take him down. Now they know with his mandate, they need to be on his side.
And speaking of sides, the other side of that particular debate is having some problems of its own. We'll be back with Tim Donner after this short break.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back on Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I remain your host, Mark Angelides, and we continue to be joined by long-time host of this here radio show, Mr. Tim Donner. Tim, thanks for sticking with us. Now, I alluded to the opposite side of the Trump camp, the Democrats, in the last segment, and how they seem to be having a bit of a problem. And it's not so much, and well, it is, of course, one of their biggest problems is who's the de facto leader of the Democratic Party at the moment. That's a big question. But specifically in relation to this last week, we saw the certification process on January 6th. And you wrote a fantastic article just ahead of that about how this January 6th would be very much an expiation of the last January 6th certification process. And so I found it fascinating because I watched the whole thing. It was very swift. There was no particular outbreaks. There were some cheers and applause here and there, and there was a very much a grinning J.D. Vance sat in the front row in the joint session. But there was a narrative being built there, as far as I could tell, and it was a Democrat narrative that was being built, and you could tell that it was an organized, specific bit of theatrics because within moments of the certification process being finished and the senators leaving the House floor, on many of the leading senators' X accounts was a very, very similar message. We oversaw a peaceful transfer of power, not like Donald Trump, blah, blah, blah. And that was the performative aspect of it, is that they wanted to use them sitting on their hands, which, let's be fair, it's not just Republicans who have objected to elections during the certification process. You'd have to go back to H.W. Bush for the last uncontested one. But they want to create this narrative that they're sane and sober. Your thoughts?
Well, I don't think anybody cares. I mean, that's the problem, is that nobody cares about their, their posturing, and they're acting as if they're morally superior to the incoming president. Nobody cares. If they really cared so much, Donald Trump wouldn't have swept every swing state and won the popular vote and won a bigger electoral college victory than he did 8 years ago. And so, that ship sailed a long time ago, the idea of trying to present themselves as being morally superior. Nobody cares that Kamala Harris followed form and gavelled in certification.
So just a quick note there. Sorry. So there's a 2022 bill that essentially removed her ability as president of the Senate to even do anything about that particular thing. So she was really just there to rubber stamp. There was nothing that she could do, even if she wanted to, because of legislation passed by the Democrats.
I'll tell you what, if trying to act like they simply executed a routine process on the day of presidential certification is the best they can do, then they're really in trouble. Because again, nobody's hardly paying attention, and nobody's sitting there saying, gee, I shouldn't have voted for Trump because these people really are morally superior to Trump. I think it's just, that train left the station a long time ago. And, this is what you get from a leaderless, rudderless party trying to figure out where they're going to go from here.
Well, that's the question, isn't it? There is definitely a lack of leadership. There's no captain to I believe it's Tucker Carlson's book, was it the Ship of Fools? I think it was. It was a great front cover on it. It was very entertaining. But now that certification is done, the inauguration is just days away. Who's the effective opposition? Now, obviously, there's the party writ large, and there's the activists here and there. But who's setting out the political compass for the Democratic Party?
Well, I think this situation is somewhat similar to where the Republicans were 12 years ago after Mitt Romney had been beaten decisively in a near landslide by Barack Obama. He went away. Nobody wanted him back. And his running mate, Paul Ryan, was still in Congress and was not considered presidential timber per se. And so they had to figure it out. And I don't know what they would have done if Donald Trump didn't come along and, upturn the whole Republican Party and eventually turn it into his own personal fiefdom, which is basically what he's done. Now, for the Democrats now, I mean, there is no real leader because Joe Biden is not in a position really to do anything in his post-presidency because he can barely get through the day. As we know, they don't schedule any appointments for him after, I believe, 4 p.m. And he's been basically missing in action since the election. Kamala Harris has, you know, I'm even among those who say it isn't her fault that she lost the election. It really was more Joe Biden's fault. But everybody knows that she is an incredibly poor candidate and no leader of a party. So you can put them aside. You've got Chuck Schumer, who's been around forever, but he's now minority leader in the Senate with only 47 Democratic votes compared to 53 for Republicans. So he's old news. Now, you do have Hakeem Jeffries, who has been quite effective as a leader of Democrats in the House. But to have the minority leader in the House of Representatives as a leader of your party is a pretty big stretch.
Something I always like to point, sorry, Tim, something I always like to point out whenever anybody brings up Representative Hakeem Jeffries is he has the ignoble honor of being the person to lose the most House leadership votes of anybody ever. So that's a record for the books for him.
Leave it to you to uncover that buried fact. But, they're going to have to really figure things out because there's, after, again, going back to the analogy of the Republicans 12 years ago after Mitt Romney lost, they had a number of candidates who, even if Trump hadn't come onto the scene, you had Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, and a bunch of other candidates, Scott Walker, who were thought to be presidential timber. But this time, the Democrats, who do they really have? I suppose Gavin Newsom, but as the face of progressivism, after progressivism had been basically disgraced and rejected by the American people, I think he missed his moment. You've got a Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania, perhaps, because he's a more moderate face of the party. And you've got, Andy Beshear, governor of Kentucky, but none of these people have national profiles at this point like Ted Cruz did, like Marco Rubio and Scott Walker did for the Republicans in 2016. So as Ricky used to say to Lucy, you got a lot of splaining to do about where you're going to take the party because it's still unclear. And I see them as being incredibly disorganized. But I think the first step back for them is to throw everything into trying to take back the House in 2026, which I think is a realistic possibility. They have a tiny deficit. It's a razor-thin margin that the Republicans have in the House. And if the Democrats can take the House back in 26, that's a good start for them on their way to a comeback.
We'll be back with Tim Donner after this short break.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And you're back on Liberty Nation Radio. We are continuing our fascinating conversation with Liberty Nation's senior political analyst and longtime host of this here radio show, Mr. Tim Donner. Now, Tim, we've covered Democrats in the wilderness. We've covered whether Donald Trump is ready for the big show this time around, more ready for the big show this time around than he was the first time around. But now I want to see what's going to happen with the anti-Trump resistance, specifically the never-Trumpers, and to borrow from Edgar Allan Poe, Nevermore, quote, the never-Trumpers. What's going to happen there?
Well, I think the title of my piece on this very subject on libertynation.com says it all. It's end times for the Never Trump movement. They've got no juice left. They've tried for 8 years to take this guy down. And we're talking about, just to be specific, these are not liberals or progressives, Democrats who kind of are obliged to oppose Donald Trump or any other Republican. I mean, they've called every Republican presidential candidate in memory a fascist. Okay, fine. It wasn't just Trump. So that kind of organized opposition you expect. But in the Never Trump movement, we're talking about disaffected Republicans. We're talking about people from the Bush, McCain, Romney era who are basically throwing a tantrum, have been throwing a tantrum about the fact that they lost control of the party, that neoconservatism has been disgraced and rejected by Republicans writ large, and they just can't take it. Bill Kristol is probably the most well-known of the Never Trumpers, having been a thought leader in the Republican Party for a long time and publisher of the Weekly Standard. And, he just took off and laced into Donald Trump from the beginning. And as I write in my article, Trump derangement syndrome started as kind of an amusing moniker for people who just didn't like Trump, couldn't bear him and his presence in the party. But then it turned into something more serious, a more organized movement with publications like The Bulwark and The Dispatch. And you had longtime Republican operatives like Rick Wilson and Steve Schmidt, strategists who would just go on TV on left-leaning outlets and tear into Donald Trump and call him names every bit as bad, maybe worse, than progressives. And so what these Never-Trumpers did over the course of time is what many people feel was traitorous. They formed alliances with the left, essentially tossing out all the beliefs that they had had for their entire political careers and make alliances with the left, supporting people that they had vigorously opposed for their entire adult lives in an effort to stop a single man, Donald Trump. And it didn't work in 2016. It certainly didn't work in 2024. And in 2020, they might want to take credit for the fact that they supported Joe Biden and helped push him over the finish line. But essentially, it's end times for this movement. They are no longer relevant. They've been discarded and disgraced in the Republican Party, and they are no longer of any use to the Democrats. I mean, I suppose they could start a Never Vance movement for 2028, but I don't think anybody's going to listen to them. They are basically out of their depth, out of time, out of credibility, and they're going to be in the political wilderness. And let's put the face of the whole Never Trump movement on Liz Cheney, who, after leading the congressional investigation into the January 6th ugliness, ran for another term as a House member in Wyoming. And because of her opposition to Trump, she was beaten by about 37 points in the Republican primary as carrying the name of perhaps the most famous family in all of Wyoming politics. But she didn't just reject Trump. She and her father both endorsed Kamala Harris. And she went out on the campaign trail with Kamala Harris, appearing jointly. And all she got for her efforts was the disdain of Republicans and Democrats saying after the fact that it was a huge mistake for Kamala Harris to put that kind of investment into Liz Cheney. So now she is out in the wilderness more than anyone. And if you want to talk about Trump derangement syndrome, the real clinical nature of it, the fact it's really been diagnosed by some psychologists as an actual mental disorder, the derangement about a single individual. think about Dick Cheney. In 2000 to 2008, if you mentioned the name Dick Cheney to a Democrat, their blood pressure would rise. They'd start screaming and yelling. They hated him almost as much as they hate Trump. So when Dick Cheney turned around and endorsed Kamala Harris, that basically symbolized, was probably the pinnacle of the Never Trump movement, being so deranged and starting, I believe, the only movement in American history designed to stop a single individual. I mean, you had abolitionists who wanted to end slavery. That was a movement. You had suffragettes who wanted to grant
Suffrage.
women the right to vote, wanted suffrage. This is the first movement, I believe, in American history that was designed to stop one individual person at the cost of everything that these people have believed for their entire political lives.
There's, I believe it's in Daniel, Book of Daniel, with the moving finger writing on the wall, Mene, tekel upharsin. You've been weighed, measured, and found wanting, and your kingdom will be torn asunder. I think that's probably quite accurate for what has happened here, because if we look at the Never Trump movement, their goal is in the name, right? Never
Right.
Donald Trump. And so they've been operating for, I think it's over 8 years now. Is it? Yes, it's just got to be just over 8 years now.
Yes.
And in 2016, Donald Trump won the presidency. In 2020, he lost the presidency, but got more votes than he did in 2016. And in 2024, surpassed it all.
Mhm.
And so all of these efforts, these reputations, these lifetimes, and really I'll mention reputations twice here, these reputations built over these lifetimes that they've had, and they've squandered it all. And what did they get? Nothing. Donald Trump improved his performance among the country in terms of the amount of votes every single election cycle. And that tells you not only were they wrong-headed to jettison their formerly firmly held beliefs, they were just not very good at it.
Well, they did produce the Lincoln Project, which is sort of the organizational face of the Never Trump movement, produced some, well-produced ads on TV, but they were so extreme and so over the top, basically saying that Donald Trump is a fascist who will turn America into a dictatorship. He's got no respect for the Constitution, et cetera, et cetera. It was so over the top that I think most people just dismissed it out of hand. And they grossly miscalculated the number of Republicans they could attract to turn away from Donald Trump. And that became pretty obvious this year, because even after the ugliness of January 6th, 2021, Republicans had moved on from that and were looking at his qualifications not as a pastor or a man of God, but as a president of the United States. And as many have said in the past, politics ain't beanbag. And Donald Trump knows how to be a power player in politics, and that's what they voted for. And so this movement now is essentially dead and buried. And I think most people in the Republican Party would have two words: good riddance.
We're going to find out what those Republican voters were actually voting for after this short break. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And you're back for the final segment of this week's Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm still your host, Mark Angelides, and we're still with Tim Donner, longtime host of this here radio show and Liberty Nation's senior political analyst. Thanks for sticking around, Tim. I know it's been a long session for us, but I think quite valuable and quite fun. So I posited the question in the end of the last segment, Tim. What were the Republican voters who returned Donald Trump to office for a second time? What were they actually voting for? And I think possibly the most important data point for that question is some recent polling by Neapolitan, the Neapolitan News Service, which is a fantastic place for polling. And what they found was that these are some fascinating numbers. is that 61% of Republican-leaning voters say that self-identify as Trump Republicans, while now only 27% say that they're Reagan Republicans. And even those who were, here's an interesting fact, even those that were around to remember the Reagan era, 54% of those ones consider themselves Trump Republicans. So I guess, I mean, maybe I've answered my own question here, but they were voted, the voters in 2024, they were voting for MAGA, not for whatever the traditional Republican Party really is nowadays. Even though, as we've discussed earlier, the neoconservative wing has been, I guess it's out. It's no longer a part of the present day GOP. So these are now MAGA voters. Does that make sense? It's not Republican votes anymore. It's MAGA voters.
Well, I think the thing that might have put it over the top in terms of people supporting Trump for his agenda rather than just the concept of sort of breaking the furniture and shaking things up in Washington, which is, I think, largely what they wanted the first time. Met a number of people after the 2016 election who were traditionally kind of left-leaning or actual Democrats who said they voted for Trump just to shake things up, having no idea that he could actually win because nobody thought he could except a small group of people here and there who sort of were wishing upon a star, at least initially. But I think the biggest difference between so-called Reagan Republicans and so-called MAGA Republicans or Trump Republicans is that Ronald Reagan was a true ideologue. He had a North Star of belief that he tried to basically apply to every situation in his presidency. He came in and tried to apply those principles wherever he could, whereas Trump is more of a transactional president. Now, he does have the America First philosophy, and how that sort of contrasts with Reagan is that it's really more populist than it is conservative. It incorporates conservatism into it. But for example, conservatives would never, traditional conservatives, Reagan conservatives would never support tariffs as a means to protect jobs in the United States. Trump and Reagan, what they share in common is, of course, a commanding personality in very different ways. You know, Reagan was old-fashioned. Trump is not old-fashioned, but he's a transactional politician in the sense that he sees a problem and tries to fix it best he knows how. Whereas Reagan more came in and said, I've got an agenda to apply these principles sort of across the entirety of his administration. So you can see, I mean, all of Reagan's appointees to his cabinet and agency heads were longtime conservatives, whereas you see with Trump that he has his appointments really are across the board. For example, he's got a pro-labor Secretary of Labor. She's a Republican, but she's a liberal Republican who has a very good relationship with labor. Ronald Reagan would never have done that. But I think that, you know, what Trump has done is in dominating the party for the last 10 years, he has turned people in his direction to a point where he owns the party. And when you own a party, there's nobody that comes close to him in terms of power in the Republican Party. When you own a party, most of the people who voted for you are going to identify with your agenda rather than the agenda of someone who was president 40 years ago.
That's fascinating. I want to come back on something you said about Reagan there and how he was a genuine ideologue. And there was a consistency with Ronald Reagan as well. And the first thought that popped into my mind there was, I'm trying to think of the year, 1964. It was we call it the a time of choosing speech now, but he just called it the speech, and he was stumping for
Barry
Barry
Goldwater.
Goldwater.
Yes.
And if you look through that speech, that is completely consistent for 1964, what he was saying in 1984. There's very little change there. And you're right, he had a compass and that was it, and that's what he followed. And then, of course, I'd like to also reference a point you said about how Trump is not an old-fashioned conservative, which is so strange because he's a very old president. He's a very
Well,
old
it's
president.
true. It's true. Well, he's a guy that knew how to play the game of
Mm,
politics from early on. Let's not forget that he built his reputation as a real estate mogul in Manhattan, which is probably the most liberal borough in the entire country. So he had to play ball.
92% Democrat. Yeah.
He had to play ball. So he set himself up as being pro-choice, being a Democrat, because that was the only way he could do business and earn the favor of the almost universally Democratic politicians at the time. But when he entered the national political stage, he came in as a Republican, although I would argue he was really more of an independent
Mm.
because he didn't just toe the party line. I mean, when he came in, Trump in 2016, and just shocked everyone by going into the South Carolina primary, South Carolina being a very defense-friendly state, and the military, a state that is heavily associated with the military. He
And
attacked.
dependent on Defense Department dollars. Yes.
That's right. And he attacked George W. Bush for the Iraq War, and people were stunned. And I, among others, thought that really might have been the end of him. But instead, he won that primary and moved forward from there all the way to the presidency. So he's more of a transactional figure in the sense that he sees a problem, tries to fix it. The problem that Trump has that Reagan didn't is that populism is by its nature a fleeting ideology because popular sentiment changes. So the question is, if people suddenly were opposed to a border wall, to pick one example, would he no longer want to build it? I think he would. But if people came out, if they're in favor of tariffs now, what if they aren't in 8 years? Would a MAGA Republican then favor tariffs? Whereas Reagan had a fixed, consistent ideology that really wasn't going to waver one way or the other. With Trump, he's a far more flexible politician. What they both have in common, of course, more than anything else, is strength. And that's what the two have in common. The Reagan Republicans that aren't never Trumpers and the Trump Republicans have far more in common than they have differences.
Yes, I think this strength position, it's because you don't actually see that very often in politics. You see a lot of pretend strength, people talking about how we're going to be determined, we're going to fight, fight, fight. But you very rarely see actual strength of character, the strength to sort of weather the political storm, regardless of what's being thrown at you. And both Reagan and Trump definitely have that. And I wonder, do you think J.D. Vance has that same strength to carry the party forward after 2028?
I don't think he does yet. He could grow into it. He's a young man. Let's remember that Trump was already approaching 70 years old when he first ran for office. So Vance will have to grow in the position. And it's very hard to follow a guy like Trump, just like it was very hard to follow a guy like Reagan, and George H.W. Bush had a lot of trouble trying to do it.
Yeah, he found that out to his dismay. Tim Donner, thanks ever so much for spending the day with us.
A lot of fun, Mark. I appreciate it.
And that's all we have time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I've been your host, Mark Angelides. I'd like to take a moment to thank our guest today, Tim Donner, longtime host of this here radio show. And of course, thank you, the listeners at home, for taking the time to tune in each and every week. We do appreciate you. Please remember, Liberty Nation does not endorse campaigns, candidates, or legislation, and this presentation is no endorsement.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.